This is Synthetik 2. I was pretty excited about this one when it came out because I loved Synthetik. I thought it was just a really good top-down roguelite. It really stands out among the crowd as still being really unique and really fun to play. But admittedly, I was a little bit afraid that this game would lose something in translation to 3D, because Synthetik was 2D, and it had a very specific art style. It still looks really unique, honestly. It's got a very striking use of color. A lot of environments are sort of monocolor, with the floor and the buildings all being a very certain shade, and it changes as you go throughout the different environments, and this really increased the readability of the game a lot, because one problem with roguelites of this sort is they get very hectic later on in the game with tons of enemies and tons of bullets and tons of stuff happening all over the screen, and it can be kind of easy to lose yourself where you are and what you're actually supposed to be shooting at, because things get so busy and hectic. But the very flat use of color that Synthetik had made the game very readable at all times. Even in the later areas where things did get very hectic and very full of action, it was still really easy to see where you are and what you were shooting at, thanks to this very flat, readable art style that pervaded the whole game. And I was kind of afraid, because that is one of the most unique aspects of Synthetik, is how it looks, that would sort of get lost with the higher detail of 3D environments that this game was going for. But actually, I'm happy to say that it really doesn't at all. Now, one thing you are seeing in the background right now is one of the environments that actually doesn't use the original's art style of very flat colors. There are still plenty of environments in the game that do use that art style, and most of them actually still use that original sort of signature Synthetik look. But there are some areas, especially these sort of outdoor military-based style environments, that do use a more complex 3D art style. However, they still are pretty readable because this sort of flat aesthetic is still present even in those more complex areas, which I think is actually a really impressive bit of visual design. Meaning that even though the areas do have a lot of increased detail because they're now fully 3D environments, it still doesn't, you don't get lost in all the detail. There's not so much greeble and stuff happening that the game becomes less readable. In fact, it actually might be a little bit more readable in some of the more complex scenarios because of the new sort of camera perspective giving you a nice wide view of all of this three-dimensional detail, and it's actually really nice looking. But of course, the sort of shift to this new art style is by far not the only change in Synthetik 2. Because as well as adding a third layer of depth, there's also a whole lot of extra gameplay depth to the game itself, which is actually kind of surprising because Synthetik was actually a pretty surprisingly depthy shooter. It may not look like it at first, but once you actually get into it, you realize there's actually a lot going on under the hood, and a lot of that has actually been increased, especially in regards to the weapon handling and the enemy variety. So one of the other really unique aspects of Synthetik was the active reload system, something that not enough games do because it's really fun, where if you hit the reload at just a specific point during its animation, you actually can reload quicker and get back into combat easier, but you have to time it right, because if you time it wrong, you'll screw it up and you'll be forced to play out the entire reload sequence instead. This game does keep that system, so all weapons still have an active reload that you can do that gives the combat a certain sort of rhythm. And that rhythm that pervades the whole combat system definitely makes the shooting just as satisfying as the original. Now, however, there's some extra layers of depth to the guns themselves. For one, they actually level up as you use them, and different weapons can have a variety of different sort of passive perks that you can look at on the weapon screen at any time during a run that you're playing, and it shows you certain things like what type of ammo they use, which determines sort of just how it handles and how it feels and how it deals with certain enemy types, and also certain things like weapons can have variants, like a variant that has a faster reload speed, or a variant that has a bonus to the damage it deals when it headshots and things like that, and you can see all these different variant effects on this weapon menu, but also there will be a sort of locked perk at the end of the list. And once you level up the weapon enough, you can unlock this in all future runs, so whenever you pick up that weapon, it will have this extra characteristic added to it that tends to be unique to each one. So that's already a load of extra depth to the weapons when they have all these extra effects that you can look into that make them handle differently from each other. But in addition to all these extra passive effects, there's also now an attachment system that weapons can go through, where you can pick up weapon parts, usually from enemy kills or from chests and stuff like that in the run, and you can spend these parts to get attachments for any weapon that you want. Different weapon rarities cost a different number of parts, and all weapons have 4 different slots. And when you actually select to get an attachment for a weapon, you'll be given a list of 3 different possible attachments that go in that one slot each time. So you'll basically get a choice of up to 12 different attachments that you sort of select 4 of as you upgrade the weapon, and these can do all sorts of things from, increasing its its weak point damage to increasing its reload speed and all sorts of other stuff like that. So this allows you to even further customize what each weapon's capabilities are, making each run feel a little bit different because you're probably going to have a different selection of weapons with a different selection of possible variants and perks, each with a different selection of attachments that you've chosen. So yeah, there's a lot of depth now to the weapon system, and it really does make the combat extra satisfying to have all this variety in place. The characters themselves that you actually play also have gotten a bit of an overhaul. Now there are 4 separate classes that you can choose from, with each one having 3 total different variants of those classes. So that's effectively like 12 classes for you to play, or at least 4 main classes and 3 subclasses each. And each character now has 4 different active abilities. They will have some sort of dodge ability, as well as something on the right mouse button that tends to be some sort of class-specific combat ability. It could be a big close-range burst, it could be some sort of like laser that you arm per shot. There's all sorts of different things. You'll also get 2 other active abilities that tend to have a longer cooldown on the 1 and 2 buttons there, and they are just all kinds of things, from like explosive ammo to grenades to flashbangs and all kinds of cool stuff. So these are your main sort of character defining abilities. And in addition to all of these, each class also gets several different passive abilities. They get some sort of focus that determines usually how their abilities interact with each other, as well as a couple of other passives that go along with that focus to improve their capabilities in some way, like giving them huge backstab damage or giving them a lot of extra survivability because they have some sort of life steal or something like that. And they of course also have a sidearm that they can start the game with, so you can unlock extra sidearms so that each class can start with a bit of a different arsenal by spending these unlock tokens that you get just by playing runs. You can also use that same data resource to unlock different focuses for each of the classes that will change the suite of passive abilities that come along with and give them a bit of a different sort of feel. So the classes actually have quite a lot of variety because of all this different stuff that you can unlock for them. And you also, every 5 levels that you get with each of these classes will give you a big unlock token thingy, and you can spend these tokens to unlock those different subclasses for each one to increase the total amount of stuff that you have to play as. So in terms of overall depth, the depth of the game from the depth of the classes that you're playing to the depth of the weapons that you're using, it has all been pretty significantly increased over the original Synthetik, which, like I said, is actually a pretty big deal because that game already had a surprising amount of depth to it. The game also treats items a little bit differently because in the original Synthetik also treated them this way. In traditional like rogue-lite shooters, the name of the game is stacking passive items, right? It's getting as many different passive items as possible that synergize with each other and make you extra powerful. But in Synthetik, you didn't actually get that many passive items. The game was more about the weapons that you were holding and the abilities of your class than it was about stacking a large number of passives. And the sequel here definitely uses that same philosophy. You do get passive items, and they are very powerful, but there aren't a whole lot of them, and you can't hold a tremendous number of them either. It's more about upgrading your weapons and using your skills well, so the items that you get tend to be very, very strong, but you get a lot fewer of them, which is a design philosophy that I actually appreciate, even though I definitely enjoy the more classic roguelite style of getting as many passes as possible to become super overpowered. I think with a game that focuses on its weapon handling and its character abilities, you do have to kind of balance it by making the items powerful, but not all over the place, or else you would just get so powerful so quickly that nothing would ever be a challenge anymore. So there are a variety of passive items that you can find, usually in chests and after boss battles and things like that, and there are also some active items that you can find. You have 2 active item slots that you can use that you tend to want to use to accentuate your various active character abilities as well. So it's nice to see that the game still uses that same sort of philosophy. One of the big changes is in the shop system. There are several different shops that you can find around the maps, and they work a lot differently than a traditional roguelite shop. You know, normally they're just full of passive items, and then you just use the money that you've obtained in that run so far to buy whatever passive items you think fit your build the best. But in this case, they're a lot more limited than that on purpose, but they're also quite significant when you do find them. Shops tend to only actually be usable once. Once you buy one single thing from a shop, that's it. It shuts down and you can't buy anything else from it. There are a couple of exceptions, but most shops work this way, which is kind of neat, honestly, because it means you have to really be very selective about what you actually buy, and you can't just save up a bunch of money and make yourself massively overpowered by finding a single shop full of good items, because you can only get one at a time. There are black market shops that tend to have items with heavy drawbacks, but some very powerful effects. There are shops that can upgrade your weapons weapons in different ways, and there are even shops that you can use to upgrade your various character abilities in different ways, and these are some of the only shops that tend to be able to be used multiple times instead of just once, but they get very expensive very quickly, so you're still pretty limited on how much you can use them, but they are significant because they permanently upgrade the power or the cooldown or some aspect of your different character skills to make yourself stronger. So when you combine all of these different upgrade aspects with the various weapon attachments and the upgrades to your passive and active character abilities and all this stuff, you get a very depthy roguelite shooter that has a lot going for it. In addition to this, it also has modding support built into the game itself, which is really, really awesome. There is a very powerful editor that you can use to make all sorts of things, and there is actually a mod browser in the main menu of the game that you can use to just browse through the various mods that are available and subscribe to them right there and start playing them immediately, which is a really big deal. As someone that loves modding, I really appreciate the fact that they have so completely integrated modding into the game itself to make it as easy as possible to actually get new stuff. And there are already all sorts of different things available, from entirely new classes and subclasses to packs of new weapons and other quality of life improvements and all kinds of stuff like that for you to browse through and actually take a look at and see if you want to use. So that's really cool. So what about the early access? Some stuff that needs improving or that needs working on? Well, for one, I mentioned that the game for the most part keeps its readability that Synthetik 1 had, and this is mostly true, but it's true in those flat colored areas that match Synthetik 1's art style. I will say that in some of the more complex 3D areas, like the military bases and the snowy areas and stuff, the readability does suffer a lot more than it does in the more flatly designed areas. So there are some areas, especially later in the game when things get very complex, which are not as readable as I would like, and I think that it's mostly focused around these more complex looking 3D environments that don't use that same flat color grading that Synthetik 1 uses. So I think those areas might need to be worked on a little bit to increase the overall readability during hectic fights and things. I also think that the overall variety is something that needs to be increased, which is, I guess, sort of obvious because that's one of the main things that tends to happen in early access, right? They add more content, so this isn't exactly a new thing to say, but definitely in terms of the item and weapon variety, there needs to be a little bit more there. Synthetik 1 had a lot of different weapons that all felt very unique and fun to use, and Synthetik 2 is well on the way to getting things like that, but it does need a few more in terms of its overall weapon variety. Even though that weapons are more depthy now with the new passives and attachment system and things, it would still be nice to have more of them in general. The same goes for items as well, both passive and active items, just some more variety in general in the stuff that you can find and pick up and shoot and use was always appreciated in a game like this, so yeah, definitely increasing the overall variety would be good. It's also a little bit buggy. I think that for an early access game, it's actually pretty polished feeling right now, but there are definitely some bugs to address. For one, it's actually quite easy to get stuck on geometry in some areas. The game needs like an unstuck button or something. It's easy to like dodge roll into a staircase and get stuck forever and things like that. That definitely needs to be addressed. There's also currently a bug with the menus for me where normally when you're in a menu, it shows you all the stuff that you can unlock and all the stuff that you have unlocked, and you can choose to spend your currency to unlock new things or start a new run and all that stuff. But after I do a run, it doesn't matter how long it was, just any run, and then go back to the lobby, all of the stuff looks like it's unlocked, but it's actually not, and it won't let me select or unlock any of it, and I have to actually restart the game in order to get the menus to work correctly again. So that obviously needs to be fixed as well. There's some menu nonsense that could be shored up a little bit, or some of the menus just don't work properly or are a little bit more clunky to use than they should be. But aside from these relatively minor, honestly, early access issues of just some bug fixing, some variety, some readability, I think it's in a really good state to become a very, very good sequel to Synthetik. I think that there's a lot here to enjoy, and I'll definitely be happy to bring you an updated video on the game when either it's got a whole bunch of updates behind it or it's pretty much out. So expect that video when the game releases. We'll see how it is then. Thank you guys very much for watching. The link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you would like to check it out yourself or to wishlist it to keep an eye on the updates. And I'll see you guys next time.